This is a presentation that was done to the Delta naturalists on September 2nd this year. And it is about a trip that Noreen and I took to Madagascar in May of 2025. We went with an outfit called Cheeseman Ecological Safaris. They put together a very interesting trip. This is the result of it. Reflecting on other trips that we've done in the past, this one stands out as being particularly interesting. It has a number of aspects. One is the pace was a little less intense than some of the birding trips we have done in the past. And in this particular instance, the focus was not primarily birds, but in fact primates, the lemurs of Madagascar, and also their insects and their birds. However, lemurs would be the primary focus. So that's the basis of the trip. And before we get started, I want to give you just a little flavor of Madagascar. We started in the capital city of Antananarivo. That's a difficult one. The locals refer to it as Tana, but I will try and remember to add the extra AN in Antananarivo. And that's where the tour started. And our first aspect was to fly south to the southern tip of Madagascar to spend some time there. Then at a place called Barenti Reserve. Then we returned to Antananarivo and went to the east into the wet areas, the rainforest. And after 3 days in the rainforest there, we returned to Antananarivo and flew to the northern tip. And we spent time at 3 different resorts in the northern part of the country. So we'll get started. We start with a picture of Antananarivo city looking from the Queen's Palace up in the hills above it. You can see it's a relatively flat area, and this is a plateau on the western side. In other words, the away from the prevailing winds and rains that come in off the Indian Ocean. And this plateau is higher elevation, so it's a little cooler than it is down on the coast. It's where the major population is and the center of the country. So to get started, we'll take a little bit of a look at the currency, which is severely inflated, I would say. This will give you an idea of the street markets where the locals get all their food on a day-to-day basis. Electricity is not common. About 30% of all the population have electricity. A high proportion of the population have cell phones, however, so they must be getting access to charging for their phones at some source. But they lack usually refrigeration, so they're shopping on a day-to-day basis. In the upper part of this movie, you can see there a beer advertised at 4,300 Ari, and that's about $1.34 Canadian. So some of the items for sale in the street stalls, these are probably per kilo, but I'm not absolutely sure of that. And prices are in the order of 600, 500, 600, sometimes a little bit more than that, up to 1,500 Ari for a unit, and I assume the unit is a kilogram. The street markets sell just about anything you can imagine, from car parts to edibles. You find your plumbing parts, rope, string, scraps, whatever. And people are all trying to make a living in this country. It's considered one of the poorest of the 10 poorest countries in the world. It's number 10, but that doesn't mean that it is well off. It's a country which a lot of the population are just living from hand to mouth. Okay. Now, one of the important aspects of what I'm going to talk about is habitat. And I put this up to give you an idea of how the habitat is different in different areas. And that can be shown by these distribution maps for different types of lemurs. And in the case of the fossa, that's the mongoose-like, cat-sized predator predator of small lemurs. So the populations are distributed along the edges. There is a mountain ridge which runs down the center, and I'll show you a little bit of that later on. But the important thing is that habitat is key. If you want to see a specific type of lemur, you have to go to the habitat in which it resides, and that is sometimes very restrictive. Madagascar is a fascinating country, and it's an island country. There aren't very many of those. It's a little smaller than Borneo, but larger than the United Kingdom. And this comparison of sizes on the right-hand side, you can see an outline of the United States. And if one drops Madagascar on the west coast, you see that it covers the area essentially from the Canadian border to the Mexican border in length. And width is probably not much more than just to the Rocky Mountains. It takes about 4 hours to fly from the northern tip to the southern tip in a turboprop aircraft, and that's the type of aircraft that are used in this country. So we made the flight from Antananarivo to the south and also from Antananarivo to the north, and both of those were about an hour and 55 minutes in each case. Madagascar is interesting in the fact that it was the last large landmass to be settled by humans, and that was around AD 350 to 500. The earliest settlers came from Indonesia, and that surprised me. I would have expected them to have arrived from Africa because that's the closest landmass, and we'll get into that a little later. France conquered the country and made it a colony in 1896, and it regained its independence in about 1960. It's gone through a number of governmental changes, one of which was a communist regime that set them back quite a ways in terms of education and tourist development. But for today, we're going to talk about flora and fauna, and 90% of it is found nowhere else on Earth. So that is particularly unique. If we look at where the population came from, you look at this map, to say that the migrants came from Indonesia is a bit surprising. But in fact, it was populated probably through the same method that the islands of the Pacific were populated. It was populated by people that had learned to sail with the wind and with the seasons, and prevailing winds move in one direction. Trade wind areas will tend to blow in the same direction on an annual basis, and they will have reverses. And the sailors knew these winds and used them to travel. How they would know to look for something like Madagascar, I have no idea, but they were the first to arrive. So Madagascar is the fourth largest island and second largest island country. The largest island country, in fact, is Indonesia, but that's a composite of 17,000 islands, I believe, whereas Madagascar is predominantly one island with a few small offshore islands. It's about 1,600 kilometers from top to bottom, and its highest mountains are in the order of 10,000 feet or just under 3,000 meters. Population, it's 30 million on this slide, but I think it's closer to 32 at the moment. And 50% of the population is under the age of 14, which is rather remarkable. Forests have been consumed by the population in order to create charcoal, which is used for all their cooking. So charcoal is a major production, and the forests have suffered as a consequence of that. Only 10% of the forest remain, and that means habitat that's important for animals such as the lemurs. So 90% of the wildlife is found nowhere else on Earth, and 5% of the world's biodiversity exists in Madagascar, which is a rather remarkable thing. If you look at the map on this page, you'll see that there are 3 mountain ranges running from the top down towards the center and across the center and then towards the bottom end. Those are essentially providing a big barrier for the winds that come off the Indian Ocean. And most of the moisture is dropped on those mountains or on the areas to the east of the mountains. And to the west of the mountains, the areas are drier, particularly in the southeast, where it's very dry. Looking at the animals in Madagascar, one has to ask where they came from, how they arrived. And if you look at it, the distance between Madagascar and the African continent is it's just over 400 kilometers, not very far. But the currents that present day run are north and south, not east-west. So it's unlikely today that anything would drift from the African continent to Madagascar. However, in the past, and we go way back to the Permian period, Madagascar was a little green dot on the left side, and I'm going to give you a little bit of color to put it into context. So present-day Africa and present-day India, which is shown in yellow, essentially were butted right up against Madagascar when it was part of Pangaea, or the original landmass. As this gradually broke up, in the lower part, known as Gondwanaland, split, India headed north, and when it ran into the Laurasia, generated the Himalayas, generated the mountains there. But it moved away from Madagascar and Africa also. Madagascar moved away from Africa, or Africa moved away from it. The separation occurred. Well, during these times, what else happened? There were mass extinction events on Earth. And mass extinction events have the consequence that you have to start essentially from scratch each time there's a mass extinction event. And if you look at these in context, so we'll put them on the movement of the Earth tectonic plates. During the Cretaceous period to present, that is the extinction event that would have had the most impact on present-day life in Madagascar. So today's primary large flora and fauna will have had to start at some point in the Cretaceous. And one of the theories is a rafting theory, and that's probably the one that has the most support today. There was once a theory of a land bridge across the Mozambique Channel connecting Madagascar to Africa. But if there had been a land bridge, you would expect some more diverse animals to have arrived in Madagascar. And what we actually see is, using a molecular clock based on genetic divergence, you can see that the lemurs probably were the first to arrive 50, 60 million years ago, followed by the tenrecs, which are the hedgehog and hedgehog relatives, then rodents and carnivores. And the carnivores are just these small, essentially mongoose size, maybe a little bigger than that, organisms such as the fossa. So if we look at that, people have argued against the rafting theory because the currents of today don't fit. But Madagascar actually moved approximately 15 million years ago to the place that it presently is. And this was about the length of the country further south originally. And the currents further south do actually move from the African continent to the east, and could potentially have carried debris from a flooding river. That would make sense, and that might be an explanation of how things, meaning animals, move to Madagascar. So why lemurs? Well, lemurs can enter a state of torpor, which I had not known. In times of food shortage or drought, they can essentially shut down their metabolism, much like the hummingbirds can when they get cold or food sources are limited. And they would be potentially able to survive a drift time of 25 to 30 days on, let's say, a raft of vegetation, which might include a tree, and the foliage on the tree would provide some meager rations, because eventually these carnivore or non-carnivorous animals made that crossing. One of the believed progenitors was the ii. It is a tree nesting species. And this is a picture of an ii taken from the internet, the two pictures in the center. One thing I'll note about the ii, it's a nocturnal species. The one that we got a brief glimpse of was in the dark with a flashlight. So these are probably taken in a zoo where they have probably encouraged them to come out in daylight. So the ii are tree nesters, and also the sportive lemurs on the right are a couple of pictures that I took of sportives. They're also tree cavity dwellers. So these are the types of ones that could potentially be drifted. I want to draw your attention to the tree on the left, and what you'll see is that it's a typical tree. You would see these in Africa, you see them in Madagascar. But if you look closely at this tree, there are two different spots on this tree where there are actually, in this case, sportive lemurs nesting. So tree nests and cavity dwellers are potentials for rafting across to Madagascar. And it appears there may have been as many as two independent events where lemur or lemur relatives that created the lemurs of today arrived by water. Madagascar is an unusual in many different ways, but its tree species are particularly fascinating. Many of you have heard of the baobab tree. These baobab trees on the right and left were These are pictures taken in the southern tip, down in the dry area around the Barenti Reserve. Baobab trees were considered in Africa and also in Madagascar the tree of life. And around here in British Columbia, our natives refer to the cedar tree as the tree of life because it provides many different aspects to their life in terms of shelter and sources of food and materials. The baobab stores water in this massive trunk, and because of its ability to store water, sometimes you can punch a hole in these trees and water will actually pour out. I saw somebody had done that in one photo that was posted on YouTube. But you can, from the inner part of these trees, get the very spongy flesh and essentially wring it out like a sponge and get water that you can actually drink. So that's quite impressive. In dry times, it provides a source of water for the people in the dry lands to the south. Madagascar palm is an intriguing looking palm tree, member of the palm family. And the spiny forests are fascinating. They're the spiky trees with very tiny leaves in between the spines. Here's a clip of some of Madagascar, and it'll give you an idea. This is a beach, and it gives you an idea that they have beautiful beaches, and it's an important tourist destination for people from Europe, particularly France in particular, because it's a French-speaking country. Rice is an important aspect of the life of all people in Madagascar. I think Lita told us that people usually eat 3 rice meals a day. These are rice paddies where they find a flat piece of land like this that they can irrigate. They can get 3 crops a year of rice. These are obviously in the growing stage, but some other places where we were, they were already harvesting. If there is no irrigation and they're dependent on the weather, they can usually get 2 crops a year. Where there's water, people do their laundry. And this was a dike area going across. A road had been built in this dike area. So there's water down below the dike, and because of that, people come and do their laundry. That's because the majority of people don't have running water in their homes. Now, the piles of bricks that you see up above are actually mud bricks, or I guess you'd call it clay bricks. They're just made in molds, dried, sun-dried, and stacked here for pickup by trucks. And they take them and build houses with these blocks. Because it's an inexpensive building material and is able to withstand a lot of weather. If you think about it, if you put a roof over top of it, it'll probably last a long time. These are just a few more street scenes, and again, people don't have electricity, they don't have refrigeration, so they are going to be in general shopping for the food that they're going to eat on that day, and maybe for a second day, but they're not going to be able to store food for a long period of time. In the city, you see these carts. This fellow is pushing, and there's somebody pulling at the front. And these are water delivery. These yellow jugs are water for drinking, cooking, etc. And it's distributed because people don't have plumbing in their houses. A lot of them don't. And a well would provide a source of water to fill the jugs, and then these individuals would probably get contracts to deliver it through town. So you can buy almost anything, as I said, from fashion clothes to auto parts. This is a cart with rubber wheels, and you can see that the cart driver is carrying a cell phone. So cell phones are around the country, and the carts are important. This is just a gecko on a lamp that I shot out of interest. Remind me that we're going to take a look at a couple of chameleons, a male on the right, bright orange, and the female, which is more camouflaged in the green. She's essentially hiding from the male, and Lena put the two together, which caused the male to turn the bright orange color, which he is. That's called the Picasso chameleon, and it is the most sought after in the pet trade. Now, the zebu, which is you saw in the cart, the last part of that film, is a symbol of wealth in the country, and often to get a wife, a young guy needs to have a bunch of zebu to essentially provide to the parents of the woman to, I don't know, bribe, pay her essentially to become his wife. Zebu is of value. And in this picture, you can see in the upper left a zebu cart with iron or steel wheels. The one in the lower left, wooden wheels. The one that I showed you before had rubber wheels. They're used for everything. And the frightening thing about them is they're out on the highway at night in the dark with no lights and no orange triangle on the back that reflects. So you really have to be careful when traveling at night. And we did travel at night on a couple of occasions. Now, we're going to go to the south first, to the area around Fort Dauphin. In the area we drove through, heading for Berenti in the south, after flying from Antananarivo to Fort Dauphin, we ran into a lot of this sisal plantations. Now, sisal is a commercial crop that is grown there. In the past, sisal was used for making rope and various things, but today a lot of Madagascar's production apparently goes to IKEA for various products that they produce. It's a fiber that's generated from the fronds, and you can see the fellow on the lower left is cutting fronds. They're stacked and then put through a machine that essentially gets rid of most of the green, and you end up with a bundle of fibers about the length of that. What's happened is the spiny forests are being replaced by these huge plantations, sisal plantations. Now, sisal has originally come from Mexico, and Madagascar is about number 4 in terms of production of sisal worldwide. Sisal takes about 7 years to go from seed to where the first fronds are harvested, and you can harvest those plants for approximately 7 years after, and then you have to replant. So it's quite an extensive period of cultivation, but obviously they don't need to do much once they get it to the established phase. On the right is a list of the ranking of the 10 poorest countries in the world, and you'll see Madagascar comes out at number 10. Okay, Berenti Reserve. Now, Berenti Reserve, we went to see primarily the ring-tailed and the Verreaux's sifaka, which is the one on the far right. But we're also brown sifaka and mouse lemurs and sportive lemurs and others that we saw nighttime ones, but the daytime ones were predominantly the ring-tailed and the Verreaux's. Now, the Verreaux's are called the dancing lemurs, and the reason they're called the dancing lemurs is because of their behavior when they land on the ground. They have very short forearms and long legs, and so if you put their hands on the ground and walked on all fours, they'd essentially be running their nose in the dirt. So when they cross open areas, they jump, and they jump sideways. And because of this sideways motion, they have the appearance of dancing. And these are just a series of frames capturing one moving across an open parking area. And they would do this on a regular basis. In the morning, probably early, they crossed from the deciduous forest into the spiny forest and spent most of the day in the spiny forest. And then they would come back from the spiny forest into the deciduous forest in the late afternoon, usually about 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, that time frame. And we would be there waiting for them with our cameras all set up to shoot at high frame rates and hopefully catch some of these poses. Now, when you look at them closely, you can see the very widely splayed distance between the big toe and the rest of the toes on the foot of the lemur here in the picture. And the same is true in the hands. There's a wide space between the thumb and the other fingers. And this affords them the ability to grab around tree trunks fairly easily. Now, I want to draw your attention to this guy on the lower right, and I'll just put him up in the middle. This shows you the two tongues that lemurs have. The fleshy tongue, which you use for taste and in the process of eating, but this essentially cartilaginous tongue that exists below the fleshy tongue is used to clean their front teeth of fur because they use their front teeth essentially as a comb. Their teeth are essentially arranged, their incisors and adjacent teeth, to form a comb-like structure that they use for grooming. And in the process of doing that, of course, hair gets stuck in between these comb-like teeth at the front, and this structure is used to clean that. It's what makes these I think it's strepsirrhine primates that have this second tongue. Okay, these are Burroughs Safaka, just coming out of the spiny forest area and getting ready to cross the parking area. But when you think about it, how do they travel around in the spiny forest? And spiny forests are quite extensive, but the trees that exist in them are basically dangerous. The Safaka are feeding on these fleshy little leaves that lie between the spines, and these spines will draw blood. I mean, they are sharp. It's not a soft, spongy spine, but a true, very hard, essentially like a hawthorn spike. And boy, you watch these things, these lemurs moving through it. This is a couple of other lemurs that we saw in the Barenti area, the gray-brown mouse lemur on the right and the white-footed sportive lemur on the left. The day gecko was, I can't remember where I actually took this picture, but we saw them in a number of places. They're just a brightly colored gecko. And here's a resident of the Barenti area also, but also much of the country, and that's Austerlitz, and it's called the giant chameleon. And this one gets up to about just over 2 feet in length, 26 inches. So a very large size chameleon. Not as colorful as the Picasso, but definitely large. And of course, birds. Noreen and I are interested in birds, and so we're collecting pictures of birds. The primary focus, I would say, of the tour with Cheesemans was, in fact, lemurs and chameleons to a lesser extent. But the guide knew his birds, and these are some of the birds that we saw on our trip. We're able to get photos of. The white-browed owl in the upper right came out I think it was early evening, and we were going on a night walk. The scops owl was, again, another one of those situations where you hear them and you're able to localize the sound and find them. The Malagasy paradise flycatcher is very similar to the African paradise flycatcher, but it's a distinct species and looks slightly different. You can see the great difference between the female and the male with its very long plumed tail. You'll often see males with shorter tails, but this particular one had a full-length plume. As the season goes on, those plumes get worn off and they shorten. The red fody on the right is, again, a weaver type of bird, very similar, related to, in a general sense, the bishop, the red bishop, which is Africa's red-colored weaver. The bishop is more red. This is more orange-colored. The Madagascar hoopie is very similar to the African hoopie and the Southeast Asian hoopie, but it's clearly a distinct species and separated from it. The crested drongo is unique to Madagascar. These are a few more of the birds that we saw. The common Newtonia is, I think, somebody said it's really a red-tailed vanga, not a common Newtonia. I put it on iNaturalist, and that was a recent report, even though I originally thought it was a common Newtonia. Probably is the red-tailed vanga, a female, so not so obvious. The Malagasy white-eye and the Madagascar pygmy kingfisher were both nighttime photos. They're birds that we happened to see at night when we were looking for snakes and frogs and various other nighttime creatures, including the nighttime lemurs. The elephant bird on far right is a photo I picked off the internet because, to me, the size difference between a human and this bird is startling. This is an extinct bird, but you can still find in Madagascar the eggs of the extinct elephant bird. Now, I don't know where they come from, but we saw one for sale in a street stall. And if you know the laws are that you're not allowed to take elephant bird eggs out of the country. So they are probably selling the elephant bird eggs to tourists who then try and take it out of the country, and it's confiscated and it goes back into the tourism trade again. So anyway, just don't try and buy an elephant bird egg, even if you see one of their eggshells for sale. These died out very shortly after man came, I think within 500 years probably of when man arrived on the island, and you can think of it as a fairly easy meal for the people. And this is the Malagasy kingfisher. Looks very much like many of the kingfishers you see in Africa and various other places in the world. A beautiful little kingfisher. Now, this is a short video. We'll give you some clips of lemurs moving, and I'll give you a little bit of information about them as we go. So they were starting in the Barenti Reserve again, and the ring-tailed lemur here sitting in the foreground is sunning itself, and somebody has strategically put the shadow in front of him, so he's not too happy about that, and he's going to move on. These lemurs warm up by facing the sun and stretching their arms out and soaking up the sunshine. Now these are the dancing, the burrows, safatra, jumping, and they jump sideways. None of the other lemurs that also jump, and a lot of the other lemur species, larger lemur species, also jump when they hit level ground, but they jump forward, not sideways. So that's why these ones have been also described as dancing lemurs. see that their tail is not being used other than probably for balance. They're not using it in their hands other than climbers' tools, and they're very efficient at moving. This is a look at Cephaka in the spiny forest, and these trees are spiny. They're not picking trees without spines to move through them. They don't differentiate one spiny tree from another spiny tree. And if you think about it, to spring from one tree to another, or even to just walk up and down, it's rather amazing. You'll also see them moving through not only the spiny forest, but also through some of the Tsingi, the limestone outcrops that are almost razor sharp, and they bound through these with no trouble. This is a ringtail sitting on a limb in the spiny forest. Another gray mouse lemur up upper right. They all are resident and move through the day. So after we left Burundi, we flew back to Antananarivo and went west, and this is some cockerel Cephaka that I took footage of in slow motion. Now this is a lemur park just on the outskirts of Antananarivo, and I took this video the day after the tour ended. A group of us went out to this. It's probably an hour's drive out of the city center, which means about 2 hours because the traffic is atrocious. And we were able to see these cockerel Cephaka moving through the trees. And you see the way they grab hold and jump. They're just like mounted on springs the way they move. And I'm just going to let you enjoy their movement for a minute. Their ability to spring up these trees, they've got great musculature and their ability to grab hold of the limbs, the vertical trunks with their opposable thumb and big toe is quite remarkable. But watch this guy, he gets ready and then he springs across. Now I missed the top of it, but get him landing, and he's landing on his feet. And we've watched lemurs do this right across a road, so quite a distance they jumped. And when he landed on the far side, the branch he landed on broke and went to the ground. He just popped up and continued on his way. But I'm sure that branches do break from time to time when they do these massive leaps and then land on them. Because they're not. These are about 4 feet tall if they stand on their hind legs. They're probably a significant weight. This guy's getting ready to spring, and you watch the launch from the tree trunk that he's on, lands on his feet, got his toes spread so that he can grab hold of those branches. And there's another couple of lemurs up above, probably sitting there, and he's going to go past them. Don't seem to worry about large diameter trunks. They just wrap around them and they'll move on through the bush and these rather massive leaps. So that's some nice slow motion of the movement of the cockerel Cephaka. Now, one thing I'll point out about the cockerel Cephaka was in a lemur park just outside the city, and they were probably removed from the pet trade. People had these as pets in Madagascar at one time, but no longer are you allowed to have any lemurs as pets. And all of them that were in the pet trade were moved to these lemur parks, and the idea is to gradually work them back into, if they're able to, back into the wild, or to get them to reproduce in these lemur parks and then introduce the young that they produce back to the wild eventually. But because you're fairly close to Antananarivo, you get to see quite a few different species in these lemur parks. Now, when we arrived back from Barenti, it was late evening, and this is the hotel we arrived at, and this is just a picture of the front of the hotel. It had all sorts of interesting antique cars, old Citroens and Renaults and some Mercedes, and had an old Harley Davidson motorcycle also. All sorts of interesting old time antiques, colonial time antiques. It's a great hotel if you want a hotel to stay in Antananarivo. Food was excellent, and the location is great in the middle of the city. Not close to the airport, but was handy for us because from here we headed to the east in order to see some of the rainforest area and spend 3 days there. So from Antananarivo heading east, we went to Andasibi Rainforest and the Mantadia National Park. And the idea was we wanted to see the Indiri. Now, the Indiri is the largest of the lemurs, and you have to get there early in the morning to hear them because they start the day out calling to one another to locate them. And here's some footage taken from YouTube that I didn't take, but was able to put together for here. These are very loud calls that allow you to localize where the Indiri are. And these are, as I said, the largest of the living lemurs. In the past, there's fossil records of lemurs approaching the size of, I think, if I'm correct, 300 pounds, might have been 300 kilos. Anyway, very large, but this is the last of the large lemurs. And thank you to somebody on YouTube for posting that. One of the places we stopped on our way was essentially a chameleon farm or chameleon display. They had all sorts of chameleons and geckos of various types and other creatures. And we spent about an hour or two there going through their various enclosures. They were very large enclosures, and you look through them, you would find all sorts of geckos. Now, the giraffe weevil on the left, the female, I took that picture. The male is an internet picture. We did not see a male, but the male has a neck that's more than twice as long as the female's. Fascinating bug. And we were just driving down the road, and the local guide said, stop, and then jumped out and pointed out this female weevil. It's about 3/4 of an inch long. I don't know how he saw it or whether he saw the vegetation and knew that was the kind of vegetation that they exist on, and that's why we stopped. But I didn't clarify that. Now, the leaf-tailed geckos are fascinating. They come in all different colors and shapes. The upper left corner is a leaf-tailed gecko where you can see all of it against the bark in the tree. It's just recently moved. The guy in the middle, very well camouflaged. And you can see a head of another one on the left. The comet moth on the right is huge. This is 8-inch wingspan and about 6 inches long in terms of the body, but it's got these long tail streamers. It's a silk moth. It weaves a silk cocoon, and you can see that up straight ahead of it. It's considered the world's largest moth, but I'm not sure I've seen anything that suggests there's anything bigger, but I'm not sure that it's always the common moth that's called the world's largest moth. And they also had some amphibians and other things as well. So the tomato frog, this was the only place we saw it, and Barron's Mantadilla, the same thing. The Madagascar bright-eyed frog we saw in many different locations over the time when we were looking for it. Tree boa we saw on several occasions. Leaf-nosed snake we only saw at this particular stop. But as you can see, interesting creatures. And I want to show you this particular leaf-tailed gecko because it is very good at camouflaging itself as on this tree trunk. But the thing that intrigues me is the camouflage of its eyes. Normally, eyes will stand out in an organism, but this guy has the ability to camouflage his eyes as well. And speaking of eyes, this is a chameleon eye. And when we were seeing all these chameleons, you can take pictures of dozens and dozens of chameleons of different colors and shapes and things. But what I was doing was accumulating pictures of eyes and sending them to my brother to give him an idea of the variability. And he said, "How do you get pictures like that of eyes?" And I said, "Well, the Canon 1 to 400 millimeter lens also works as a macro lens if you stand back from the organism, and they sit still and you just have to wait for them to look at you and then focus. And some of them are a little fuzzy because my handhelds are not all that steady. But chameleons of all colors and sizes and shapes. So after spending 3 days in the rainforest area, we headed back to Antananarivo and then flew up to Diego Suarez. Again, about an hour and 55 minutes was the flight time. And this is a view from the hotel room we stayed in for the last 3 days we were up there. The other 2 resorts that we stayed in were not on the coast, but the last 3 days we spent on the coast, and this was our view from the hotel room. So, looking at the right-hand map here, we arrived at Antananarivo and drove the yellow route south. And then at this point, went to the west towards the Arana bush camp. And this red stretch of road took over an hour. And that is in a 4x4 with sometimes going through deep water. But we went to the Arana bush camp. And then subsequently, we went to I'll show you these subsequently. From the Arana bush camp, we went out and down to see the Picasso chameleons, and also another excursion to the Dariana Reserve to see lemurs and to see ii. But first, into the bush camp. The bush camp was interesting, back in the middle of nowhere. They obviously had power because they were well off the power lines. And these are just a few of the things that we saw in this area. The black lemur camp was up on a ridge. And I took that picture one evening when we were out for a walk. This is the Arana, the porch of our cabana in this resort, and it was on a lakefront. And to give you an idea of the place that we were staying in, they were mud and wattle constructs. The walls woven with sticks and then packed with mud from both sides. And here, just by the door, there was a chunk of mud missing from an area, so you could see that the wattle is in the wall and the mud is just smeared on it and dries quite hard. So there were no bug screens and there were essentially no bugs, but there were frogs in the toilet and various things like that. It made it an interesting place to stay. Rather remarkable that they built these houses. And of course, the question was, what did we do there? Well, we went on an evening walk in this hot, humid area, and it was probably about a 45-minute walk, and we were traveling a fair distance. And it turned out what we were looking for was Brooksii nana, world's smallest chameleon. We were hiking along towards the escarpment, started climbing up this limestone escarpment edge. And after we'd gone a little while, I think people were beginning to grumble because we were pretty hot and pretty steamy in climbing. And Lita, who was the guide that had taken us through the whole tour, said to our local guide, whose name was Elaine, can we look here? Do we have to go all the way to the top? And Elaine said, I guess we can look here. And the reason that they were headed to the top was Elaine and his brother, Angelique, and their twin brothers had discovered this particular chameleon with a research crew. And so that he was taking us to where he had actually discovered. Well, where we stopped, we actually found three of them in the detritus under our feet and around along the trail. And this is a picture of him holding one on a blade of grass. And they're called the world's smallest chameleon. And maybe they'll find smaller, but this was definitely a tiny little guy. Not much, not the size of a small finger. Intriguing. So our main reason for going to this particular camp was to see this chameleon that Elaine had found with his brother. The other one was the Picasso chameleon. This is not a particularly sharp focus picture, but it gives you an idea of the chameleon walking along a bare stick. And this is a male, and I showed you in the video a female who's a darker color. If you put a female near the male, he'll brighten up really bright, and I guess that's reading colors. Or you put another male close by, he'll also brightly color up. These chameleons only exist in about a 3-kilometer area, an area bounded by nothing in particular. It just happens to be where they're found and nowhere else. And interestingly, the pet trade is trying to find out where they're found, obviously, because it's an important revenue generator for them. We were able to see, I think, 3 colorful ones just in the area that we stopped. And then we went further to the east and looking for Tattersall's sifaka, which is an endangered and uncommon. The Lita had hired locals to go out ahead of us and to actually find where the troops were. So we met with these locals, and they took us right to this group in the forest. Didn't take very long to come across them, and they're a curious animal. They don't scoot away from you. Interesting looking and interested lemurs, again with the tail. And the other place we were looking for, that was the other lemur we were looking for, was the eye, and that was a trip we climbed probably about 40 minutes up in the dark with flashlights, and then in the area where the 3 natives had already localized a nest that was occupied. We waited, and sure enough, one of these guys stuck its head out of the nest, and as I mentioned, they shone a flashlight on it, and it ducked back in, and that was the last of our view. But coming back down, we were fortunate to run into some other sportive lemurs, and I'll show you those subsequently. This is a black sifaka, and we went to Sifaka, or the black lemur, was at Black Lemur Lodge. This is a fork-marked lemur that was observed as we were coming out from looking for the eye. And then from our balcony at the lodge, I took this picture of these two crowned lemurs. The one on the left is a male, and the one on the right is a female. It's a little bit smaller, but it's grayer, and the male is a little more rufous colored when you look at him from the front. But that was the best picture that I could get of them. They were just moving by in front of our balcony as I was sitting looking at some pictures, I guess it was. I heard noise in the foliage, and sure enough, there's what was there. So all told, we saw 68 different species of birds, and 44 of those were lifers for us, and 19 of the lemurs that are out during the day. Some of those were in lemur parks, so not in the wild, but in the wild setting. And 9 of 77 nocturnal, and those would be the mouse lemurs and the sportive lemurs and eye and things like that. So not many of the nighttime creatures, but many of the daytime. These are some of the children just by one of the schools that we visited with the fellow who established Black Lemur Camp. So I'm going to leave you with a brown lemur from Lemur Island, I believe it was. And that's the story, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Of all the trips we've done, it's probably the most fascinating. So if you plan on going to Madagascar at some time, I'd move it ahead on your bucket list, because the number of people is not diminishing, and their impact on the populations is leading to loss of species. So that's it. Thank you.